Okay, today's lesson is going to be on 4 ways to prove 2 lines are parallel. You're going to be using the vocabulary that we've been learning for this unit, including corresponding angles, alternate interior angles, alternate exterior angles, and consecutive interior. So if you're not sure about those, review your notes from previous days. The first thing you're going to do is use what you know about corresponding angles and parallel lines. For instance, if you know that angle A is here, you know that this angle is a straight angle, so you can figure out A. Now, how can you figure out B? Think about the relationship between those and solve for B. Do that for angles A through M on your guided notes. So pause the video right now to give yourself time to do that, and then when you complete it, come back to the video, start it again, and check your work. These are the answers for angles A through M. If you have trouble figuring out how some of them were calculated, talk to someone in your group to try to figure out. The next thing you're going to do is identify pairs of angles in this diagram. Complete the chart in your guided notes. So in your notes, there's space to list all the pairs of corresponding angles. So there may be more than one answer. So list all the pairs that you can find. Pause the video now so that you can fill in your chart. When you complete it, come back to the video and check your answers. Okay, here are the correct answers. Here are some things that you know. You know that if you have 2 lines cut by a transversal and the lines are parallel, then you know from our last lesson that the resulting corresponding angles are congruent. Okay? If you have lines parallel, then alternate interior angles are congruent. If you have lines parallel, then alternate exterior angles are congruent. And if you have lines that are parallel, then same side interior angles or consecutive interior angles are supplementary. Now, the thing that all of these have in common, and we talked about it last time, is that you have to know this first. You have to know that these lines are parallel. Without that being true, the rest of the statement is just nonsense. It's not going to work. So using this slide, complete the next part of the notes. Given 2 parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then you know that the following pairs of angles are congruent. So list the 3 types of angles that are congruent. Given 2 parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then you know that the following pairs of angles are supplementary. So complete that line. Pause the video at any time to give yourself time to complete your notes. Now, what's the converse of each statement? And is the converse true? So if 2 lines are cut by a transversal or parallel, then corresponding angles are congruent. Now, that is true. But what about the converse? The converse is in blue. If 2 lines and a transversal form corresponding angles that are congruent, then the lines are parallel. So this is also true. So go through each one of these statements and write the converse on your paper. You'll notice that all the converses are true. So circle true. Pause the video so that you can complete the notes for slides 5 and slide 6. So here are all the converse statements. Notice that now the resulting that the lines are parallel is your conclusion instead of your hypothesis as it was before. So we have, these are all converses, so they are if Q, then P. So we have written the converse for each one. Notice that the converse and the conditional both work. They're both true. So when we have both the converse and the conditional are true, that means that you can write a biconditional statement. So lines are parallel if and only if corresponding angles are congruent. Lines are parallel if and only if alternate interior angles are congruent. Lines are parallel if and only if alternate exterior angles are congruent. And lines are parallel if and only if same side interior angles or consecutive interior angles are supplementary. So the 4 ways to prove that 2 lines are parallel, you may use these methods. 1, if you're given that corresponding angles are congruent, then you can say, oh, the lines are parallel. If you're given that alternate interior angles are congruent, then you can say that the lines are parallel. If you're given that alternate exterior angles are congruent, then you can say the lines are parallel. And you can also say if you have consecutive interior angles and they're supplementary, then you know the lines are parallel. So notice in all of these, our conclusion is that the lines are parallel. So that means that what we're doing is we're proving lines parallel when we're proving the conclusion. So take a minute to pause the video and list the 4 ways to prove that 2 lines cut by a transversal are parallel. Okay, compare the original with the converse. The original conditional statements that we learned the previous class were that if lines are parallel, corresponding angles are congruent. Notice in each one of these original conditional statements, we have the lines are parallel is the beginning. Okay, that is our hypothesis. Whereas the angles are the ones that we're proving are congruent, or in the case of supplementary interior angles, that they're consecutive interior angles, we're saying that they are supplementary. Now with the converse, we have the opposite thing going on. Here, we're given that certain angles have special relationships, whether they're equal or supplementary, and then because we know that, we can conclude that the lines are parallel. So write down what is the hypothesis and what is your conclusion. So it says on your paper, what's the difference? The hypothesis, remember, is what you start with. Be careful which reasoning you choose when you're justifying a step in a proof. It's very important to know what you're starting with so that you can have the right conclusion. If you start with parallel lines, then you will use the original conditional. But if you're starting with angle congruency, as you are here with converse statements, that means you're using the converse. What are you starting with in this statement? What's the hypothesis and what's the conclusion? This goes in your notes. So angle A and angle B are corresponding angles and are congruent. Therefore, line M and N are parallel. So what am I starting with? What is my hypothesis? I'm starting with the fact that A and B are corresponding angles and they are congruent. So I can write that I have corresponding angles are congruent, means, or I'm going to say therefore, lines, oops, it didn't ask me for that. It only asked me for my hypothesis. So let me just stop right there. Okay? So I'm starting with the fact that I have corresponding angles congruent. Okay? Now, which reason am I going to use in the proof? I would then state that my conclusion is that lines are parallel. So am I using the conditional or am I using the original? Since I'm starting with the angles, I know that I'm using the converse. So what I want you to do in slides 11, 12, and 13 is I want you to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. Notice for this one, it's only the angles, these little marks right here, the triangles, are telling us that M and N are parallel. So what are you starting with? And then what do you think your conclusion could be about angles A and B? You're going to be writing either the conditional or the converse that you did for slides 5 and 6. So you can look back on the first page of your guided notes to help you. Okay, once you've completed slides 10 through 13, let's try our first proof. Okay, so for this one, angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. I really think it's a good idea to mark the angles in any information that you're given. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and angle 1 is also congruent to angle 3. Okay, what I'm trying to prove is that AB right here is parallel to CD. Okay, so think about that for a moment. Pause the video, try to write something out, and then come back and see if you got something along the same lines as what I wrote. Now, before I write the reason here, I want you to notice what we're starting with and what we're finishing with. We're starting with angles congruent. congruent. And we're finishing with lines parallel. So because we're finishing with lines parallel, I know that's going to be my conclusion. So my conclusion is that I have lines parallel. Forgive me trying to write with this. I know it's messy. Okay, so my conclusion is that lines are parallel. Well, how did I get that? If you look at the relationships between angle 2 and angle 3, so this is my last step, 2 and 3. Notice here is a transversal. So 2 and 3 are alternate interior angles. So all I have to write is alternate interior, and I'm going to abbreviate it because I just really am struggling writing this. Alternate interior angles congruent. Therefore, the lines are parallel. Okay, so it's very important to know what your hypothesis is so that, and what your conclusion is, so you pick the right theorem. Okay, so let's try another one. So here you're given that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. Okay, what we're trying to prove is that angle L, or excuse me, not angle, line L and line M are parallel to each other. So look at that and see if you can come up with a way to prove that. Okay, so when I look at this one, I'm just going to kind of talk through it, and then I'm going to let you write it up. Okay, you know the given, so you know that's going to be your first step. Now, the second one, notice that since I know that 1 and 2 are congruent, I'm thinking about what is their relationship. And their relationship is that of alternate interior angles. I know that if alternate interior angles are congruent, then I know the lines are parallel. So that tells me that L is parallel to N. Now look at the angles 3 and angle 4. Angles 3 and 4 are also congruent. They're also alternate interior angles. So they tell me that N and M are parallel to each other. So now, is L going to be parallel to M? And if so, by what property? Okay, now this is a property that may seem very logical to you, but you may not have thought about it, is that if lines are parallel to the same line, then the lines are parallel. It's like the transitive property for parallel lines. Finish writing up that proof before you continue. The second part of your lesson today is on equations of parallel lines. So what do you know about parallel lines? There are two things that are important. I want you to write these down on your paper. Parallel lines have two qualities. They're both important. They have to have the same slope and they have to be coplanar. It's not enough to say parallel lines don't intersect, okay? Because also skew lines don't intersect. So you need to state that they are coplanar and that they have the same slope. That's something that goes in your guided notes. The two equations that we've been studying are in your notes: slope-intercept form and point-slope form. So, using the information given, write the equation of the line N parallel to line T. Okay, so this is the equation of line T. Line N is parallel parallel to line T. We know that. So that means that line N has a slope. So I'm going to write the slope of N. I'm just going to put a little N right here. The slope of line N has to be the same as that of T since they're parallel to each other. So I know the slope is going to be 3/2. Now line N passes through the point 6, 1. So what would be the equation in point slope form? So remember, point slope is y minus y sub 1 equals m times x minus x sub 1. So my equation is just going to be y minus 1, because that's my y value, equals 3/2 times x minus 6. So this is the equation in point slope form. Okay, here's the equation of line T. Using the information, write the equation of line N parallel to T. So what's my slope this time? The slope is right here, so it's 3. N is parallel to T, so let's write that equation. We're doing again in point slope form. So y minus the 1, because 1 is my y value still, equals, this time, negative 3 x minus 6. Okay, so that was just a quick review of that. You will be doing some more practice with that on Math Space for your homework. All right, is there enough information given to state that any two lines are parallel? If so, which pairs of lines are parallel and what's your reasoning? Now, this is a very important part of the lesson. I don't want you to just breeze through it. I want you to really think about it. So please take a moment to look at these, write down your answers, and then come back to the video and listen to my explanation. Okay? So pause the video now, do some thinking, because this is probably the most challenging part of the lesson. Okay, here's my explanation. So when I'm looking at this, I notice that these two are not equal to each other. Okay, and if they're corresponding angles, and so they would need to be equal to each other if Q and R were parallel. So they're not, so I know that Q and R are not parallel to each other. So then the other thing I want to check out is what's the relationship between these two? Well, 95, they really don't have a name, but this would be 95 and 95. And so for those to be, for M to be parallel to N, that would mean that 95 plus 85 has to equal 180, and it does. So there's enough information for me to say that this line M and this line N are parallel to each other, and the reason is that my same side interior, this angle right here and this angle right here, same side interior or consecutive interior, are supplementary. So since they're supplementary, M is parallel to N. So that's what I can state. M is parallel to N because those two angles are supplementary. Now when I look at the other one, I can see that this is 60. This one is also 60. Okay, so that's 60 and 60. These two are not supplementary, so I know that M and N are not parallel in this figure. So then when I look at the other this is a linear pair, this angle is, so I know that this is 60. Well, if you notice, here and here, these are corresponding angles. So corresponding angles congruent means the lines are parallel. So in this one, I can say that Q is parallel to R because I have corresponding angles that are congruent. Okay, so here's your assignments. I want you to go to MathSpace, go to the two assignments that you have. One is on parallel lines and the other one is on equations of parallel lines. If you have extra time, which I think you should, you need to learn some new constructions. There's a link that you can type in, or you can go to it through Blackboard, to construct a line parallel to the one given through a point not on the line. And there's the link. Now this is a construction that you're required to know. It will be on a quiz or test coming up, so you're going to have to practice it. It is a complicated construction. Okay, I'm sorry I can't be there with you, but I hope you've enjoyed this lesson.